On mute, there we go. Sorry. I got it all nicely tucked into me pocket and everything as well, now I've pulled it out. I was saying it feels like absolutely ages since I've stood up here to speak. Having been away in Canada for sort of 3 weeks, it was, way back in December was the last time I actually got to sort of speak to you guys. So, we're kicking back a bit. So it's really nice just to be able to stand up here and be able to share with you guys for a few minutes sort of maybe where my heart's been the last few weeks, having been away and spent some time over with Victory Churches in Canada, and then to get to spend some time with people in church as well over the last few weeks and really sort of see where people are at as well. So I'm really looking forward to this morning. So if nobody else is, I am. Hopefully you guys are as well. So this morning we're talking about doing His will, which is a title that Will gave me to talk about. And I was thinking about it, and one of the things I wanted to talk about this morning was we're going to look at the book of Philemon. Now, if you don't know how long that book is and you're thinking he's going to talk on an entire book and we've only got 25 minutes, it's only one chapter long, so we haven't got to panic too much. And we're going to do sort of an overview of it rather than read all the way through it. But I don't know about you guys, but I get quite a lot of communication through emails. People email me about stuff. And there's certain times when you see the message subject for the email and you panic a little bit because you just know what's going to be in that email. You don't have to open it, you just kind of get the sense this isn't going to be an email I'm going to enjoy reading. I'm going to ask Alex if he can stick up that picture for me, and unfortunately for you guys, you're going to kind of have to look all the way over there. But I kind of see the book of Philemon as a bit of an email that Paul sends. In modern days, he wouldn't write an entire letter to send this off. He wouldn't write an entire book. It would probably just be a quick email that he'd shoot off to Philemon to say, here you go, this is a message that you need to know. And I have the funny feeling that when Philemon gets this email, he would see the message, the sort of subject field, and he would be a bit concerned himself. Now, for those people who can't read it over there, we'll quickly go over it. It's in standard sort of mail on an Apple phone because that was where I stole it from. So it says, from Paul, prisoner@rome.org.it, because he was a prisoner in Rome at the time in Italy. I've got my facts right on this. To Philemon, and he's carbon copied in Apphia, Archippus, and the church at home.org.mdt. MDT is modern day Turkey because that was where the church was at the time. And the subject title was The Return of Onesimus. Now, for anyone who doesn't know who Onesimus was a slave of Philemon who ran away and disappeared. And Paul describes Onesimus as someone who had no value to Philemon. Now, I don't know about you, but most people you can find some value in. And yet Paul describes him as having absolutely no value. That must have been a terrible slave. Not only could he not do his job, but he ran away and was of no value at all to Philemon. So I can imagine when Philemon opens this email up from Paul and sees the subject title, The Return of Onesimus, he's thinking, oh dear, I've got to take this useless slave back, and I've got to do it because it's Paul telling me to do it. And we're going to take a quick look at some of the verses in Philemon. So if you've got your Bible, you can turn there with me. We won't, as I say, read through all of it, but we will take a quick glance over some of it. As I say, he would have got this email and thought, oh dear, what's going to happen? Paul's telling me I've got to take Onesimus back. And what Paul does is he goes on to explain that whilst Onesimus has spent some time with Paul, he's had a change of heart. There's been something in him that's developed. And Paul now says, even though at one point he was of no use to you, now he is of value, so you should take him back. So Paul is explaining the fact that this slave who ran away has had a change of heart. He spent some time with Paul, and Paul has taken him on and adopted him as if he was his own son. That's how much value Paul found in Onesimus. Now, Philemon's probably reading through this email and thinking, okay, that's great, but what am I going to do with this slave who was absolutely no good to me? He might be of some value now, but how am I going to take him sort of back in? And Paul says not to take him back in as a slave, but to give him some value in what he's doing, to take him back as a person, to further the ministry that God had called them to the ministry that they were doing in the city where they were. And we read through, and Paul is basically laying out a foundation for the calling that Onesimus has on his life, and he's instructing Philemon on how he can help Onesimus achieve that calling on his life. And as I say, sometimes you get emails and you just know from the subject title what's going to happen. I'm sure when Philemon read this, he didn't expect Paul to say this. And as you read through the book, he even goes on to say that if Onesimus owed you anything when he left, if he took anything with him, or if there was a debt that was paid, put it on my tab. Paul says, account it all to me. I'll cover the cost of whatever it will take for Onesimus to come back into the calling that I've got for him. It's an interesting sort of point of view to look from, because I think many of us as Christians have people that maybe we've took on and took under our wings, and they've disappointed us or let us down or done something wrong, and they've kind of disappeared, and we've just kind of had to write them off and say, well, that didn't work out, on to the next new person that I can try and help. And I'm sure Philemon had the same mentality, that we've wrote that person off, he's never coming back, he's gone, we don't have to worry anymore, I'll write off that debt, I'm never going to see any of that back. But actually what happens is, not only does Paul send him back, but Paul sends him back with a mandate to be more than he ever was before, and that Philemon has to change his viewpoint on how he looks at Onesimus. And I think many of us would have to do the same if someone was coming back to us who had either wronged us or hurt us, that actually for us to be able to give them any worth in what we're doing as Christians, we have to change our viewpoint on how we see them. We were talking earlier about that passage in 1 Corinthians 15 that I read, that it says that death has been swallowed up in victory, and that the weight of sin is the law, and that Christ came so that there is no longer any weight to that. And so when we accept people back, we have to see them in the light of what Christ did for them. But there's an interesting thing in this, is that Onesimus had to have a change of heart as well. Paul wasn't telling him just to take him back as the way he was, as the slave that he was when he left. Paul had seen that there was a change in his heart, and now he was writing Philemon to encourage him to take Onesimus back. And I love a passage in John chapter 1, as I said last week. John chapter 1 is one of my favourite chapters in the whole Bible. And the first 19 verses, I just love reading. I can read over and over and over again. But from verse 11 in John chapter 1, it says this. He said, it came to his own, it's talking about Jesus, and his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And then he goes on to say, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And so it's one of my favourite passages in the whole of the Bible. But what I love is the fact that when John writes here, he talks about how those who accept Christ, those who received Christ, received the right to become children of God. It doesn't say that they instantly became children of God, but they received the right. Another word that it uses is authority. You have the authority as a child of God, but you have to know how to walk in that authority. If you're going to do the will of God, if you're going to do the things that God has called you to do, the things that God has put in your life and purpose for you, you have to know that you have the authority to operate as a child of God and understand what that means to be a child of God, to be able to operate in those things and to know what his will is for our lives. We have to know that we're walking in the authority that's given us, that we have authority over sin, over death, over destruction because of what Christ did for us. That it says that he came to the world full of grace and truth. And if we don't realise how much that grace and truth is available for us, we'll walk around, like I said earlier, as if we have to attain a level of achievement, that we have to live a certain way for God to love us. And what Paul is writing to Philemon is he's saying that because of the heart change that Onesimus had, he's no longer coming back to you as a slave, no longer coming back to you as someone who owes you a debt. I will wipe away that debt because I've seen the change in his heart. It takes a real sort of humble man, I think. Like Philemon must have been very humble to be able to read this letter from Paul and then just welcome Onesimus back. I would have been very interested. I doubt it happened, but it would have been very interesting if Paul had sent Onesimus with the letter, because Philemon might have seen Onesimus coming down the road and thought, oh dear, this slave's coming back. I've got some terrible things in store for him. He's treated me horrendously. He ran off. And then just as Onesimus gets to Philemon, he hands him a letter and says, this is from Paul, and sort of panics because he knows that all this wrath and all this trouble is coming from Philemon. And you can imagine Philemon kind of just snatching it out of his hand and thinking, right, I'll read this letter from Paul and then I'll deal with you. And so he opens up this letter and he reads the first part of it, and he starts to get a little bit encouraged. Paul doesn't immediately address the subject. I don't know if you've seen people like that, but I've certainly had that, where you've had conversations with people and you know all the way through the conversation that they're building up to something, but they have an awful lot of small talk that they're going to go through before they get to it, and they kind of work their way around. And some people are very good at working their way around to it, and they come in very subtly with their main thrust. Other people aren't so good, and they just go, bam, that's what I wanted to tell you. So they have all the small talk, and all of a sudden they change and they just give you it like a bombshell. Paul does quite a good job of building up Philemon first. He encourages him in what he's doing. He says that when we hear about the work that you guys are doing, it brings us so much joy in our hearts. By the way, I'm sending Onesimus back to you. You kind of need to accept him back, not as a slave, but as a son of God, because I've accepted him and adopted him as my own son. And you can imagine Philemon's reading through this letter, and initially he's angry with Onesimus, and then as he reads through, he gets a little bit of a perk in his spirit, and then as he gets through to the end, there must have been a very humble heart in Philemon to be able to just accept what Paul had wrote and say, okay, I'm going to accept you back into the ministry that we've got here. And not only am I going to accept you back as a slave, but I recognise the position that Paul has given you. I'm going to accept you back into that position. And as I say, for many of us, it might be the same, that if we had someone come back to us, and maybe all of you have started sort of thinking of those people, and some of you might not be able to think, and some might have a list as long as your arm of people who you wouldn't want to see back through near your front door, knocking on the door or anything like that. But imagine if we all got this letter from Paul, or all got this email from Paul that said, by the way, so-and-so is coming back to you. I don't want you just to accept them back as they are, but I want you to realise that something has changed in their heart, and that you've now got to accept them as more than what they were before. And I think that's really emphasised when we read the verse that it says that man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. God sees the change of people's hearts and knows what they're capable of. What we have to learn to do is to be able to discern what people's hearts are and how people have changed. See, we quite often see the person rather than the heart of the person, and so we see the person that they were and not the change of heart that has happened in them. Quite often we look at all the rubbish that they've been through, and we see the rubbish that they've got, and we keep that attached to them. Even though they've stepped out of that and moved on from that, we can very easily pin that back onto them. And this is what Paul's kind of trying to address in this letter. Is he's saying Onesimus had all this rubbish pinned to him when he left, but because of the grace of God, all of that's gone. You need to see him in a different light. If we could all look at people in that kind of light, I think we would view people very differently, that we would always see people with the grace of God. We would always look at people from a point of grace. But we have to know what the will of God is, not only for other people's lives, but for our lives as well. You could sit there and say, well, that's great, but what is the will of God for my life? What should I be doing? And I'm going to flick over quickly to Matthew chapter 18. It says this in Matthew chapter 18 and verse 14. For any of you who aren't aware, in Matthew chapter 18, Jesus is sharing the story of the lost sheep, where he has 99 sheep and one of them goes missing. So he leaves the 99 and goes and searches for the one. And I shall read from verse 12. It says, what do you think? If a man had 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, does he not leave the 99 and go to the mountains to seek the one that is straying? And if he should find it, assuredly I say to you, he rejoices more over that sheep than over the 99 that did not go astray. Even so, it is not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little children should perish. See, here at the end of this parable, we hear a little glimpse of what the will of the Father is, what God's will is for us and for every other person in this world. The will of God is not that any person should perish, but that all should come to know Christ. So if God's will is that all should be able to find Christ, then we have to learn how we can operate in that will. That doesn't mean that we're all going to be called to be evangelists. That doesn't mean that we're all going to be able to go out and preach on the streets and see thousands and hundreds of people saved. People like Billy Graham, Mark mentioned earlier, he's a wonderful example of someone who operated in that ministry as an evangelist. But just because he operated in the God-given calling doesn't mean that we're not operating in the will of God when we talk to the person at the corner shop about how our week's been and the things that God's done for us. We might not operate as an evangelist on a stage preaching to thousands of people, but we can talk to our neighbour and say how good God's been to us this week. That is us operating in the will of God. But what we learn is that as we grow in that will of God, as we operate in the will of God, that actually we develop ourselves in our character grows, the position that we have grows, and we begin to change ourselves as well. The more people that we focus on rather than focusing on ourselves, that actually we begin to grow in and of ourselves. And there's different positions, as it were, within a Christian lifestyle that you go through. It talks about this in 1 John chapter 2, where it says that there are little children, young men, and fathers. And what I'm going to ask is, Mark, Matt, and Paul, could you grab one of those chairs each for me and bring them onto the stage? I like physical demonstrations, and I find I learn best visually. Some people don't learn best visually. Some people learn best audibly or by doing things. So if you learn best audibly, close your eyes for the next 5 minutes and just listen. Just stick them across here for me, thank you. If you learn best physically, then go home and recreate this. And you might need to find 4 chairs and some volunteers. Thank you, guys. Matt, could you sit in my first chair for me? I got asked if we were doing blind date this morning. This isn't blind date. It has a point. So, as I said, in 1 John chapter 2, it talks about how there are different positions in a Christian lifestyle, different stages that we go through as a Christian. So I want you to picture Matt as a little child. You probably should have had a shave this morning, it might have been easier. But picture Matt as a little child for me. He's the first stage of a Christian. And he's sat in this chair. Paul, I'm going to get you to volunteer for me as well. Would you sit in my second chair? Now, Paul's sitting in the second stage of a Christian. I'm not going to make you talk, so you're all right. You can just sit there and look pretty. Or else just sit there. So Paul is our second stage. He is a young man. He's a young man in the faith. And Sam, could you be my third position for me? Could you sit in that chair? I'm going to step slightly to the side so you can see these guys. So Sam is our third position of Christian. You want to feel taller? So he is a father in the faith. Now what happens, I want you to imagine that these guys are sat at a table. I don't know if you guys for Christmas we always had family round, and we would all go around to our nan and granddads, and we would have everybody there, and there would probably be about 20 people, and there'd be nan and granddad and their 3 children, and then sort of their 10 grandchildren or whatever, and everybody would sit around a table, and when we got to a certain size we would sit around 2 tables because we couldn't fit around one, and you'd have like a children's table and an adult's table, and there was always one poor teenager who was sort of 19, 20 who had to sit on the children's table to keep them in line because none of the adults wanted to do it. And they weren't quite old enough to be on the adults' table. So they sat on the child's table and felt awkwardly out of place. Fortunately, I had cousins who were just a little bit older than me, so I never had to do that. So I want you to imagine these guys are sat around a table. And what happens is, as a new believer, if I were to come in, we're going to have a progression in that direction. So keep in mind, progression that direction. If I were to come in as a new believer, not knowing anything, and to join the table, if I accepted Christ, as it talks about in 1 John, if I accepted Christ and became the right to become a child of God, then I would become this first position. I would sit in the first seat as a child. Many of you might be looking and you might recognise this demonstration. If any of you do, it was Pastor Kelly Stickle who did this a few years ago. If you don't remember it, hopefully you'll remember it after this.
That one.
Were you? There you go. Yeah. Hopefully you didn't digress down the seats. Hopefully we should have progressed you further up, shouldn't we? I apologise for that. So the first position is as a child. That's the first place that we come in. Now, I don't know about you guys, but if you have children, you can't just sort of leave them alone and sort of say, you'll be fine, just leave you there, and then everybody else kind of enjoys and just ignores the child. They have to be looked after a little bit, don't they? They might learn how to do things themselves. There's a progression that children go through. They start to eat themselves and feed themselves. But actually they need an eye keeping on them. It's a little bit irresponsible to just sort of stick them there in a corner and say, have fun. we'll see you in a couple of hours. You have to look after children. And I think that's one of the first mistakes that we can quite often make in church, is that we get new believers in and we either stick them in a corner and don't let them do anything, or we let them do whatever they like and don't keep any eye on them. There's an important balance that we have to find as believers when we see new people come into church, when we see people give their lives to God. If they're not given a seat at the table, they'll feel left out and they'll never come back. If they're given free reign of the table to do what they like, they'll throw everything everywhere, make a mess, and then we're left to clean it up. The thing is, children make a mess whatever you do. What we have to learn to do is to deal with that mess and control it the best way that we can. That doesn't mean that we put pressure on Matt as a child to sort of squash him and keep him in a box, but we give him the freedom to operate in the giftings that he's got whilst keeping an eye on him and making sure that he's not putting himself or other people in danger. That's kind of the first rule of parenting, is that whatever mess happens, you kind of make sure that they're not put in real danger. If we do that successfully, what we see is that we get a progression from a young child to a young man, someone who can now feed themselves. We would not expect Paul to sit there with his mouth open and have to do sort of like choo-choo train with all his food and feed him like that. Paul is capable of feeding himself. He's probably capable of going out and buying food himself. If he's like me as a teenager, before he got to the dinner table, he would have already stopped at the shop, bought a load of food, ate loads of junk, and then turned up at the dinner table and ate the vegetables and looked healthy. But I'd already had the chocolate bars and stuff before I got there. But Paul is quite capable of feeding himself, but he has to be aware of what he's feeding himself. If he's constantly feeding himself on junk and rubbish, he'll get fat, he'll get idle, and he won't do very much. If he's feeding himself on good things, if he's giving himself good nutrition, then he'll grow and develop and become stronger and be able to do things. If you feed constantly on rubbish, you don't feel like doing anything. And that's kind of the same in our spiritual walk. If we feed ourselves on rubbish, if we don't guard what comes into our hearts, then actually we feel very idle. We just feel like sitting there and doing very, very little. But if we feed ourselves on good stuff, if we allow the Word of God to feed our spirit, then we grow and begin to develop. And the third state that we develop to, I'm going to go to the other side, is we become fathers. Fathers are able to reproduce other children. They're able to recreate. Sorry, Sam. No suggestions. But they're able to recreate themselves. So what Sam is now able to do is Sam is responsible for looking out for the little children and helping them grow in their Christian walk. You might have a problem child here. But Sam is now responsible not only for feeding himself, but being able to source food for other people. He has to provide for the children who can't provide for themselves. And that's the same in our spiritual walk, is that when we get to a certain point, we have to be able to provide and feed young Christians who come into the faith and don't know what they need to learn, what they need. We need to be able to make sure that we're feeding them good, wholesome food that will help them to grow. We need to ground them in the Word so they can grow in spiritual maturity. Mark, I'm going to ask you if you could grab that last chair for me, and then if you could take it and drop it somewhere behind Sam for me on the stage. And then if you can hang about on the stage for me as well, because there's kind of a fourth position that sometimes is at a table. And this is, yeah, that would be wonderful. This is what's known as the high chair. Mark, could you sit on the high chair for me? See, what happens sometimes is when young children come into the faith, they're stuck in the high chair, close to the father who can keep an eye on him. But what happens is if that young person in the high chair starts to muck about, the father has to change his viewpoint to him and takes all of his attention away onto Mark. And so now Mark is taking all of Sam's attention, and these guys aren't getting any attention. They're not getting any focus because all of the attention is being put on Mark. Now the funny thing is that it doesn't really matter what age you are in your faith. People can sometimes find themselves sat in a high chair. They can sometimes find themselves totally dependent on other people to help them, totally dependent on other people for them to give them everything that they need, and they won't do anything themselves. And if they get ignored for more than a second, they throw a temper tantrum and they take all the attention of the fathers again. What we need is people... See, Sam will always have one eye on the person behind him, because he knows that that could cause problems.
Or just ignore him.
Or just ignore him. The problem is then, if Mark gets ignored, food starts getting thrown about, he starts making a lot of noise. And all the distraction and all the focus is focused towards Mark. What we don't want in the church is people who are stuck in a high chair, left there, and draw all the attention away from the fathers in the faith. You know, Billy Graham was a father in the faith. There was many people who have sat at his table and learnt from him. I think I might need to ask Mark to sit back down. It seems like he's distracting people. I've got people laughing. I don't know who it is. I can't see everybody. What Billy Graham had loads of people who would sit at his table who have learnt from him, who have progressed from young children who knew absolutely nothing, growing into young men who were able to fend for themselves, learn for themselves. But what then happens is they become fathers who reproduce young children. But what happened with our family is when we would meet for Christmas, we would all be together. But when the grandchildren start having children, there's too many people around that table for everybody to meet in one place. So the parents, you've got the grandparents and then the parents, they go and they start having their own meals. They create their own table. They create a position where they can then nourish the youngest and allow them to progress. Because it can't be totally focused on the grandfathers of the faith to feed everybody. It has to get to a point where the fathers are then reproducing new children who can learn and grow. And that should be exactly the same in the church, is that we should see people who go from being children in the faith, that they learn and learn to feed themselves, that then they learn how to teach other people, and then they take on the responsibility of then fathering other people and having their own table. And I want to leave you with this thought because we're running out of time. Where would you see yourself in your Christian lifestyle on this table? Do you see yourself as a young Christian just coming to the faith and not really sure what you want to be doing, but you're full of energy and just want to be doing something for God? Look for a father, look for someone who can feed you. If you see yourself as a young child, someone who can fend for themselves, how can you progress from there? How can you learn to become a father? If you see yourself as a father, who is it that you're reproducing? Who is it that you're feeding and providing for so that they can then develop? But what I really hope is that none of us would look around this morning and decide that you were sat in the high chair and you were drawing all of the attention from people. And that actually, if you weren't getting all of the attention, you went into a bit of a paddy and decided that I'm the most important person in this room. Why is nobody paying attention to me? We should never find ourselves there as Christians. But what happens is if we don't keep an eye on our spiritual progress, as it were, if we don't keep an eye on our spiritual state, we do find ourselves longing for attention from other people. We find ourselves craving attention from people and craving food from other people, and we become a drain on other people. But if we find a way to feed ourselves, if we find a way to get out of our high chair and move into the table, then actually we can become growing Christians who can mature and grow in the faith. So thank you guys so much for your help. You can take a seat back on the floor. Well, or you can take a seat, you don't have to sit on the floor. Thank you, Paul. So as I say, I want to leave you with that question this morning. Where do you see yourself? And how can you progress from where you are now to the next stage in your walk? If you already see yourself as a father, if you see people that you're mentoring, do you see people that you're building up? How can you create your own table? How can you create an environment where you are responsible for providing for other people? Maybe you're ready to start a home group. Maybe you're ready to do something within the church. But you have to be able to address where you are as a Christian in your walk. You have to be able to discern where you are. And if you're not very good at discerning where you are, ask the people around you, because they'll have a pretty good idea of where they are and where you're sat at that table. So, as I say, that's kind of what I want to leave you guys with this morning. But think about, where do you sit and where do you want to be? Do you just want to be sat in a high chair where people are constantly giving you all the attention? It might feel like a nice place to be, but the fact is it's very restricted. When you're sat in the high chair, you can't get out, you can't do anything, and you get left in a corner, and all the attention might be on you, but you're not actually gaining anything. You're not growing and developing. So I'm going to finish there as we've sort of run out of time, but thank you.
Have a blessed Sunday afternoon, and enjoy fellowship, and be blessed. Amen.